Trent has sent me an incredibly long bio, so I'm going to. Trent is an amazing activist. First elected Darebin Council in 2008, led the development of Darebin's climate policy over the past 11 years, including getting Darebin to become the first council in the world of any size of government to declare a climate emergency, which, you know, in and of itself is pretty amazing. You know, the first thing. Will say that was on the back of a fairly concerted effort, I think it's fair to say, Jane, is that right? From Darebin Climate Action Now. Jane, is many things subtle or you know, tending to give up is not one of them. And lots of other local climate activists. Trent is also founder of Climate Emergency Australia, a new coalition of Australian councils, which you may be talking about, I don't know, and organisations committed to driving urgent action at all levels of government. Prior to becoming a councillor, Trent was part of the initiating group for Transition Darebin. Trent was also co-founder of Darebin Solar Saver, which has been installed 4,000 households over the past 4 years. He's a proud parent. How did your grand final go?
Don't follow the football.
No, you're.
Yeah, the soccer. Yeah, no, we didn't do too well. So yeah, but we're resilient, and we'll be back next year.
Can we welcome Trent McCarthy?
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge we are on the land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect to elders past, present and particularly emerging. I also want to copy the words and echo the words of Marco Belimo, who's a young student striker in my community in Darebin, who at the bottom of his emails has something which I've copied, which is actually to talk about the link between climate justice and justice for Indigenous people all over the world, and that those two things are intimately linked. So I'd like to just echo those sentiments. It's really hard to follow Violet and with the singing, and so I'm not going to launch into song. I am going to try to sing, though, a merry tune of action and what it looks like when a government does declare a climate emergency, but also to understand the very great gap between what is happening and also what is needed. And I think I'd probably like to also acknowledge that I fully endorse, as someone who's in a position as an elected member of a local council, I fully endorse everything that you've just heard in terms of Extinction Rebellion and the aims, because it is so clear to me as someone that's been involved in local councils since 2008 and involved in parliamentary processes through lobbying politicians, that our political system is completely failing us. And so I fully endorse all of my community members and anyone that wishes to get out there and rebel. And at the next council meeting, I'll be asking Darebin Council actually to write to both the Premier and the Police Minister and the Chief Commissioner, and also obviously their federal counterparts, to recognise that what's happening with student strikes and what's happening with civil disobedience and what's going to be happening obviously in the Spring Rebellion is in a great tradition of non-violent resistance and civil disobedience, and that police need to act in concert with that and not respond violently, but in fact respect people's right to sometimes break laws in order to actually enact great change. So I just want to let you know that that's a question that I'm going to be asking other councils to do as well, because civil society is absolutely essential, and civil organisations are absolutely critical to standing alongside our community. I'm going to take you through a really quick run through of what happens when a council declares a climate emergency, what local councils are and aren't doing, and what this means for our action in the emergency over the next coming years, because we are in an interesting period in time. As I mentioned before, and as Paul mentioned, I've been a councillor for 11 years, and when I first got onto council, I was pretty proud of myself, because the council officers at the time, who are wonderful people, proposed that we have a 50% reduction of carbon emissions in our community by 2020. 50% reduction. We had a 100% emissions reduction target for the organisation, but we said we reckon the community can only get to 50% reduction. And through engagement with people like Jane and others in my community, it was very clear that we needed to be striving well beyond that. So that was in 2008-9, and we got a zero emissions target through at the council. Darebin's always had a very strong I suppose, level of activism as a local council on a whole range of issues, and has always had strong climate policies. But it wasn't until the 5th of December 2016, that I think we took the biggest step we've ever taken by actually declaring a climate emergency and being the first government in the world to do so. And we didn't do that because a group of councillors thought that was a good idea. We did that because our community demanded it of us. And it was actually Jane Morton, who you saw before, who's written a fantastic book that I encourage you to get a copy of. It's online, it's there, who actually got me to sign the Climate Emergency Declaration and to commit that after the elections that we would get council to actually declare a climate emergency and to do that. So politicians, political actors in the system respond to community pressure. And in fact, walking into the council chambers in our first meeting in 2016 after the elections, and knowing that 7 of the 9 councillors had actually signed the climate emergency declaration before the election, 2 hadn't, but 7 of them had, meant that I was confident in putting forward that motion because the community consensus had been felt. We didn't actually know what that meant when you declare a climate emergency. We thought we were pretty good in terms of doing our bulk buy solar programs and doing energy efficiency work and supporting our great community groups like Transition Australia Convergence. So it's been a learning journey, to be frank, and I think that we are getting better, but I think there is so far to go in terms of what needs to be done. So I'm going to give you some stories about the gap, but also some hope in terms of some of the things we've learned, particularly in recent months. So I just mentioned about our community call for urgent action. Just out of interest, who here knows if their council has declared a climate emergency? Yep. Whether they have? Yep, you know, absolutely have. When a council does, you usually know about it. Of all the climate emergency declarations that have happened, particularly in Australia, and there's about 47 in Australia, constituting 8% of all 563 local governments, it becomes a big news. And it becomes news because people ask a second question, which is, well, what does this mean? The council's been doing some great environmental programs. Does this change anything? And it can change something, but it hasn't changed in every instance. And so this is where citizens, whether through Extinction Rebellion, student strikes, or just local groups or transition groups, actually play a powerful role in maintaining the pressure to turn that commitment into action. So what does that commitment into action look like? Well, for Darebin, one of the things that we did is that we did the next important step, which is that once you make a declaration, you've then got to have a plan. Because if you don't undertake the process of doing a plan, and plans are essential in local government, councils will not dedicate resources or commit to actions unless there is some logical framework that they can point back to. And the reason why they do that is because councils, particularly in Victoria, are a child of the state government. They literally are subservient in all legal forms to the state government. They are formed by an Act of Parliament called the Local Government Act. And if a council acts outside of its powers within the Local Government Act, the minister can sack that council. And this has happened from time to time. So it's not that we're in fear of that, but that we stretch the boundaries. And there's been an argument put to me that we should actually try to exceed our powers so that we do get sacked. So that we actually test the limits of the Act. We're not doing that just at the moment, but who knows what the future holds. So these commitments that we made under our climate emergency plan weren't just about what we could do, but they were also about recognising that in order for our community to be safe and to have any sense of certainty about the future, it wasn't just the actions of the council, but it was the actions of other levels of government, of business, of community that were absolutely essential to making that shift and change. This is before the Extinction Rebellion, so the language of activism was very much couched in the sort of activism that we'd seen, not in the civil disobedience space. So it's really important to recognise that this plan was done before the massive upsurge, and I think that our plan would even be a little bit different had we only just done this now. So what's critical is for a council to do that, because what they then do is they recognise the ability to take action, the ability to mobilise, but also where those gaps are going to be. And the reality is for a council like Darebin, despite it being one of the biggest councils in Victoria, there are a whole lot of things that we can't do, and therefore we must pressure for the powers to do those things or to support others to do those things. So this was effectively the commitment that we made, which was to recognise that we're in a state of climate emergency that requires urgent action by all levels of government. Now, it's become the case since December 2016 that you cannot run as a successful candidate in any election, whether it's local councils, state or federal elections, unless you come out and you declare an emergency and you commit to giving a speech in Parliament about declaring a climate emergency. Jane and others in our community have made sure that there is a an expectation that politicians, regardless of their political persuasion, if they're serious about representing our community, they need to speak the language of climate emergency. That doesn't mean that their parties have changed their policies, but it means that they must be in lockstep with the political culture of our community. It's an important thing to recognise, because it's meant that we've had people step up in Parliament and actually talk about the climate emergency and not necessarily fully understand what that means, but they've got to be in that space. So we've got to keep affecting change up through the political system. Our goals were pretty clear, we thought, but how we were going to achieve those goals wasn't necessarily always clear. And this is important to realise. Councils commit to lots of things, but they don't always know how they're going to do them. And I'm happy for people, if they want to get a copy of this presentation, I'm happy to provide this to you. These are the 9 key directions. I want to just echo the sentiments that Violet made before around the importance of not just talking about mitigation and adaptation, but talking about drawdown. Because the biggest challenge that we have at the moment is that we haven't had a conversation at a national level around what drawdown looks like at that national and local and also global scale. It is a huge effort. It requires an enormous amount of shift and change in terms of resources, but it is absolutely essential. What else have we done? I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I do want to name a couple of key things that we've done in our process. And we've held a lot of events and activities that are really about trying to bring our community into the conversation, because just like any organisation, whether it's a council or even a business or a community group, you have what's called a social licence to operate, which means that you, in order to carry out those policies and to continue to carry out those policies beyond your particular time in power or in influence, you need to bring people along with you. And so one of the things that we've been doing is bringing sporting clubs into the conversation, educating them about the climate emergency, bringing our neighbourhood houses in, making them the local frontiers, really making sure that this is a broad-based movement, not just that the council's here with the activist community and then there's everything else happening over there. I'll just step through this. This is our council plan. If you've ever read a council plan, they don't tend to be the sexiest documents going around, and I say that in the kindest possible way. However, what was critical is that we got a commitment to action on a climate emergency in our council plan. It is the document which the local government minister signs off, and effectively the local government minister has endorsed Darebin Council to take action in the climate emergency. That was an important thing for us, because it's meant that we can test the limits of the Local Government Act as much as we can by dedicating resources to mobilisation and resources to doing things quite differently. And the council plan is adopted within the first 6 months of a council. So if your council hasn't gone through the climate emergency declaration process, there's still time. You've got council elections in October next year. Get anyone that's standing for council to commit to a declaration, but just as importantly as that, get them to commit to making the #1 objective of your council plan in the next term to action on the climate emergency. That's what we've got in there, and it's meant a big change in terms of our council and how it operates. I want to take just a step back from there though, just quickly, which is that part of the challenge for local governments, and you'll see this regardless of whether it's a country council, a city council, a coastal council, is understanding what action on the climate emergency means for them locally. And for Darebin, we were lucky that we had a program called the Solar Saver program, which we invented a few years ago, and it meant that effectively we identified there were a whole bunch of people in our community that could not put solar on their roofs, were dying in their homes or being admitted to hospital because they could not keep their homes cool during heat waves, and they had no mechanism to do that. And so what we did is we created a program which meant that we could put solar on anyone's roof with no upfront costs, and they could pay that back through their rates over time, and they would always be in front. And so we targeted this at 300 pensioner households, swap them across to solar, and then to turn them into renewable energy ambassadors. What's interesting about this is that the people who were the first tranche of those people are now very proud of being taking action on climate change, even though their starting point was actually reducing their household power bill. So you can shift people's attitudes from one space to another through actually engaging them in action. And we're talking about what we describe I describe it as the Nonna effect, because the highest concentration of solar saver households were Italian women in Reservoir who had huge power bills and were serious at risk and had a huge peer group as well. So the Nonna effect was the flow-on effect of that peer-based marketing. I won't go through this too much. This is the technical basis to solar savers, but any council in Victoria can do this, and it means that you bring together two things, which is the ability to switch your whole community across to solar, but also to do the social justice piece, which is to remove the upfront costs of this sort of technology for households, regardless of whether they're renting, whether they are high income, low income, it doesn't really matter. And of course, we've proven over the number of years that this program works, which means that the state government has since copied a version of this because they want to back winners. So we've tried to elevate the stories upwards of what works and how to do it more. They haven't, through that large-scale solar program that they've got rolling at the moment, they haven't quite done it as well because they have missed the social equity element. But we continue to converse with them about it. And I mentioned before about the nonna effect as well. So we try to use what are described as catchy cultural indicators for people, and that helps people understand that they're part of a movement, not just action on the climate emergency, but something that's quite local as well. The critical thing for us, though, is that we declared a climate emergency. So what did that mean for our Solar Savers program? Well, it meant that we already had a thing in place where we could scale up. Previously, I tried to get Solar Savers to go from 300 houses to 1,000 houses, and I couldn't get council support for it. After we declared a climate emergency, we were able to get council to commit to 4,000 households over 4 years, which costs council $20 million. The majority of that money comes back. So I just want to explain what that means. We use the climate emergency framing to get the council to commit to something that was effectively more than 10 times bigger than what it had done before in terms of action. And a $20 million investment is a lot of money for a council to put solar on people's roofs when in fact it won't see that money for probably the best part of a decade. What's been great is that not only have we had fantastic activism from groups like Darabin Climate Action Now, who had, obviously Jane and others, have done enormous work both within election cycles and outside of election cycles, but we've also seen the growth of other groups. So Community Action in Climate Emergencies, run by a few individuals in our community who do extraordinary work going around and actually encouraging other councils to declare. So they've taken our story at Darabin and propagated that to other places, and most recently one of the councils that has declared a climate emergency is the Shire of Yarra Ranges, which became the 1,000th council in the world and the 47th in Australia. And that was off the back of some activism and direct contact between these activists saying, if Darabin can do it, then surely you can do it in the Yarra Ranges. So there's been a ripple effect. Sorry, what's that? So Melbourne City Council has now declared a climate and ecological emergency. The big question for a city like Melbourne is, what does that mean in practice? Because they already had a huge renewable energy program, but what does that mean for their internal work? So they've got some really good councillors here, but they've got a big job ahead of them to actually shift the organisation. Sydney's also done the same thing, as has Hobart. Capital cities are in a slightly different situation to places like Darabin and the Yarra Ranges, because most of their buildings are actually commercial buildings. So how do they mobilise the commercial sector? So I wouldn't want to be a Melbourne City Councillor right now. It's a big challenge, but we've got to encourage them and keep on them to keep going. I just want to explain very quickly, this is the methodology that we've been thinking about in the local government sector, which is this notion of upward pressure through the political system, sideways pressure to other councils, and what we describe as sort of downwards pressure, although I'm not so keen on that framing, which is really to infiltrate the groups in our community and get them thinking about climate emergency in their context as well. And that's this impact. The one that's not on this picture is actually the internal, which is that councils need to shift internally. And one of the biggest shifts that we've had recently in Darabin is that our CEO, after quite a lot of pressure from councillors, had a meeting with her executive management team, and they identified that on their what's called the risk framework for Darabin, that climate emergency is a strategic risk for the entire organisation, which now means that every single department within council needs to start reporting on what it's doing in response to climate emergency. It needs to have a plan of action, and it needs to report on that on a constant basis. It means that in an area like aged care, our aged care workers need to be climate emergency crusaders. They need to be checking out whether people are at serious risk. They need to be feeding that back into the organisation and helping those people be safe during heat waves or other events. It also means that we need to actually get other parts of the organisation, like the people that reseal the roads, to actually think about renewable products rather than the same old business as usual approach. And in fact, they've done that. So all of Darebin's roads now, which have to be resealed by Victorian legislation, are resealed with recycled tyres, which is a 99% zero emissions product, which is great. So reusing, repurposing, closing the circular economy. That's very quickly just the list of all the councils in Australia that have declared, and there's now over 1,000 around the world, 1,008. I was hurriedly trying to update my slides just before because it literally keeps changing. This is from a website called Cedamia, CEDAMIA.org.au, and Margaret Hender at Cedamia keeps a constant register on the numbers and the population. It's a massively growing movement in 19 countries. Not every declaration has resulted in corresponding action. We've had declarations made in Canada, and then 2 days later they approved gas and oil projects. So we're on a constant battle to maintain the integrity of the movement, but we stand in solidarity with the student strikers, Extinction Rebellion and others. Very quickly, we can't ever show enough pictures of Greta Thunberg. Greta is a huge inspiration, but in August, Greta held her first student strike outside the Swedish Parliament. In the same month, and I just want to show you where business as usual exists, the Victorian Parliament updated the Planning and Environment Act, which is the second most significant piece of legislation in Victoria for local councils, and I did a word search to see how many times the word climate appears in the Victorian Planning and Environment Act, which dictates all land use decisions. So if you want to make decisions about planning and development, land use, this is the act that governs those decisions. And not once does the word climate appear in this piece of legislation, which was as recently updated as August last year. I say this because this is, for councils, this is the new frontier of advocacy. My friends in coastal councils cannot say no to developments that are likely to be inundated through sea level rise and flood inundation. My country cousins, who I love deeply, are so deeply frustrated that they are having houses being approved and developments being approved in not only bushfire zones, but in zones that are high climate emergency risk zones as well. So we need to get, this is, for us as councils, this is the next frontier of legislative change that we'll be fighting for. Very quickly, I'll zip through this, Paul, just really quickly. I just want to give one bit of good feedback, which is that one of the things that we have done at Darebin, and this is what mobilisation looks at the council-to-council level, is that we've enacted what's called the Local Government Power Purchasing Agreement. So we've brought together 48 councils around Victoria. We've said to them, what if we could help you shift your electricity consumption as a council from fossil fuels to renewables, and that those renewables would be new renewables, so new wind, new solar, these sorts of things. As it's turned out, of the 79 councils in Victoria, we've got 48 of them on board, including Darebin. They have all committed to doing this. Some have committed 100% of their electricity supply. Some have committed 80% because they want to do some local projects as well. This project has just kind of come to the stage where we're about to go out to tender to see who's going to build a solar farm, who's going to build wind farms to provide power for all the Victorian, over half of Victorian councils. There are 79 councils in Victoria, 48 of them are on board. Effectively, this collective amount of electricity is going to shift from fossil fuels and fossil fuel consumed to solar and wind. It's going to result in 250 gigawatts of new renewable energy through local government, which is 45% of all the power that local councils use. It means it's the equivalent of taking 47,000 households or 87,000 cars off fossil fuels. It is massive, and I can't underestimate this. And the reason why is that these are the councils that have signed on, and the vast majority of them are not climate emergency councils. So I'm now going back to these councils and saying, well done, you're part of the power purchase agreement. You're actually going to save money by switching to renewables. Now, do the next thing, declare a climate emergency, get on board with this movement. We're at the phase right now where we're about to take this public. Literally, no one else has seen this information, so you're the first people outside of the local government sector to see this. I just want to show you one thing. This actually resulted in, here we go, oops, sorry, I've dropped out of it. The critical thing here, I won't show you more because I don't want to keep you any more time, but to get to that stage, we had to mobilise 1,000 people in the local government sector. 1,000 people. Because they were the managers, CEOs, councillors, environmental officers, financial executives, 1,000 people were mobilised in local government, and we've switched effectively 45% of local government's electricity across to renewables. So that's kind of mobilisation in the council context, but it must be greater and bigger and stronger and faster, because that's what we need. I'll end it there. Thank you, and sorry for going over time.